Kirsh is the synth that is actually too human. Like, sometimes really good writing and really good acting, come together. And this is one of the results. This fascinating character who deserves so much attention under a microscope. And so let's kind of take a look at him. Like, this is a very unique character because most of the synthetics in the Alien Earth or in Alien series are built to serve. They're guards, they're workers, they're mostly tools. But Kirsh, on the other hand, is a scientist and a mentor. He's a synthetic who teaches other synthetics, including like hybrids like Wendy, like how to exist. So this gives him authority, but also this greater burden of responsibility. He isn't just performing, humanity. He's reshaping the next generation of artificial beings. So he's super aware of all of this, makes him very self-aware. Ordinary synths might follow programming without deeper questioning, but what he's demonstrated is this heightened self-awareness. He reflects on his role, he recognizes the tension between function and freedom. He feels the weight of morality in a way that the others don't. So this is kind of a gift and a curse because it makes him more human than the other synths, but it also means he's more tortured because he understands the larger picture. And he works in the zones of attachment and emotions, whereas other synths kind of keep a distance, a clinical distance. He doesn't. He forms bonds. He bonds with Wendy. He mentors. He protects. He shows signs of really great empathy. And this makes him very vulnerable once we kind of, once you care, you open yourself up to a lot of things like grief and regret and attachment. And while most synthetics don't feel that burden, he uniquely does. He doesn't just operate. Like his whole existence is questioning. He asks why. Why should synthetics serve humans? Why should Wendy embrace her hybrid state? Why does he even exist? So this is a true existential streak that sets him different. So he's not content just being, another cog in his wheel, whereas other synthetics really, accept their place. He wrestles with it. So, and this is all internal. You see it in subtle movements. It's very subtle the way that it's portrayed on the screen. So, I think he stands out and he represents this philosophical side of the artificial life, the artificial intelligence. And this is kind of what happens when it's too close to being humans, and he's mimicking how we question things and our curiosity about these things, and if he has the ability to transcend. And at what point is this imitation becoming like its own identity? Because that's where he is, especially as he's shaping, synths or hybrids that are clearly cognitively developing under him. He sees all this from this larger view, and he maintains an interesting role. We saw his interaction with Morrow, who really, like, that was the intersection, is between those two. And I'm going to talk about that interaction separately because it's so noteworthy, because they're coming from the standpoint of two beings that are kind of crossing over. Remember, Morrow is a human who has robotic parts, whereas he is a synth who is mimicking human behavior. So between them is that, like, between these two almost extremes, in their world, they're extremes of one another. We would see them as being closer together, but it's in that gap of difference between what these two are. One is pretending to be a human. That's what he would say about the other one. So I want to talk a little bit more about that in a separate piece, but I just kind of want to just scratch the surface on Kirsh, who to me just a fascinating character, and he's going to reveal more of it in his role as this mentor, philosopher, AI that, again, is trained in a different way. His core is different, and this drives this behavior from him. But if you have more that you want to add to it, please drop it in the comment section. But as always, you hit that like and subscribe.